A lot of what makes me angry, and in favor of sex workers is that there's a lot to be stated about this. I started with my rant. There's two of them though. Why anger at radical feminism at this point? Radical feminism basically said it's an act of violence for man to buy sex against women, but by doing this, it just gets to change the definition of violence, assume authority over other women, and impose its views on women who do not share its point of view. Radical feminist hegemony is essentially getting to impose its morals on people who, not just men, but women too, who don't necessarily see things the way it does. Its morals are imposed on all the Nordic countries in their view of sex work. I never thought I'd be living in 2026 and some authoritarian brats get to call themselves feminist, but European radical feminists don't actually give a fuck about women. All they care about is stamping out the world's oldest profession. If they really cared about women, they'd be working to improve the working conditions of the women actually doing the fucking sex work in the first place, but they want them gone. The pseudo-feminist project seeks to eliminate women who do not align themselves with the anti-sex work agenda. It's hegemonic, it imposes its morals on women who do not share its views. They're tyrants, and I'm fucking tired of it. I really am. I fucking had it. If these women gave a single solitary fuck, for instance, about other women, they would not, for example, let the European government get away with defining brothel keeping as any group of two sex working women working together, or two people, period, working together, because there's safety in numbers, and yet they force them to work in isolated, yet alone, where they can be killed off by serial killers if, somebody happens to show up. I'm sure they don't have this in mind, but unintended consequences. This is a very easily foreseeable unintended consequence, and I don't give a shit if it's unintended anymore. When you're complicit if you create conditions like this. These quote radical feminist unquote are trying to get sex working women killed. Basically, and when it happens, the blood is on their hands. The strain of radical feminist thought is tyranny. Those who have this ideology are a problem. Their laws, their views are so over the top. There are female misogynists who want the women who do sex work stamped out of existence by any means necessary. So they say that they want to stamp out prostitution, but in reality, they want to stamp out prostitutes. That's the truth, of this. And they can pretend otherwise. They'll deny it, but who gives a fuck about if they deny it? It's a fair accusation. Deny it all you want. It's the fucking truth. Maybe you're just in denial about yourself and your own intentions. These laws are so over the top. They are female misogynist with the women who do sex work stamped out of existence by any means necessary in order to realize a world without the world's old profession. And what we're seeing in the Nordic model is an attempt to basically stamp it out, and regardless of the human cost, they don't care. They want it gone. They want it eliminated. Whether or not it is actually possible to realize a world without prostitution or not, they don't care. They want to, do anything they possibly can. And, I basically said I condemn them and their ideology. They're not friends nor sisters of mine, and I do not consider them radical nor feminist, just tyrants. The cold-hearted apathy towards women in this trade shows they don't give a fuck about you, like I do, and I can see through their lies, and so and then I went into it again with another statement about this whole thing because there was more that needed to be said, as there often is in my case. I feel like much is not being stated about sex work, so I will write about it. Foremost, they ask us the wrong question. Do you want your daughter running access to your body for sex? Imagine that she already is. Why aren't her working conditions as safe for them, as safe as possible for them to be? I'm going to continue, though. In the United States, we do not eliminate jobs just because they happen to be hazardous, but for some reason sex work seems to be a special case. If we went about eliminating jobs because they happen to be hazardous, I wouldn't even be here right now able to record this video because the electricity necessary for me to do it would not exist. So my anger looks like this. For example, in France, I do not dispute that sex work is dangerous and hazardous. It will always be hazardous, but if we didn't do things because they were hazardous or dangerous, the entire scientific field of chemistry as well as electrical engineering would be eliminated. In other words, my view as applied to sex work is that it is dangerous, but steps can be taken to make it less dangerous. However, the French government and those advocating for the Nordic model, they are pushing for a system that has made damn certain women have to, for example, work alone. Whether this is conscience or not, whether they realize that this is how it actually works in practice or not. This is what happens. Because if they team up for safety in numbers, they're basically guilty of brothel keeping under the current definitions of brothel keeping. If they hire bodyguards, that bodyguard can be charged with pimping. And, to observe the scope and horror of these laws, you need only look at Operation Homeless, which tried to drive a lot of these women that were doing the work of prostitution out into homelessness. The Nordic model in practice takes a dangerous situation, because selling sex is dangerous, and it makes it a crime to do anything that would make it safer. So if another Jack the Ripper starts killing these working girls, as I'm trying to refer to them in a much more PC way, to women who rent access to their vaginas for money, advocates of the Nordic model are complicit in this context. This is basically what I'm trying to say is, feminists are not wrong to be critical of prostitution on the grounds that it is dangerous and risky, and it exposes women to conditions that are less than optimal or desirable. None of that, from this framework of thought, is thought of as disputed. You're right about all of that. My problem, is that if something is dangerous, we can do things to make it less so. There are steps that can be taken to manage danger. Safer sex practices, for example, working in numbers. Having guards and everything, having panic room button. Having a panic button for rape alerts and that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot of things that could theoretically be done to make the work of actually offering this kind of service safer. And yet, under the European model at this point, since it's so hell-driven to eliminate and stamp out, prostitution, it doesn't even begin to think about the ways that steps could be taken to reduce a lot of the very things that it concerns itself with. Like that's what I find so glaring. I mean, like, when I look at what's happening in France and I study it, in the streets there and everything that is happening, what I can see is a horror show, where to me it's like, the people that defend this will say, why are these girls doing this? This work is dangerous and everything. And I'll be like, well, it is dangerous. You're right. But it seems so incredibly too intuitively obvious to me that, just because this is hazardous doesn't mean that nothing could possibly be done in theory to make, this situation less hazardous than it is, to manage the danger, to reduce the harm that is being done to the working girls in this context. And I find it upsetting on those grounds. It's a lot of the reaction that we're getting, because these people, they'll say that, sex work, look, the sex work is dangerous. Yeah, sure. No disagreement here, good sir, but the fucking problem that I'm having here is that, just because it's dangerous doesn't mean that nothing can be done to to mitigate the danger, to make, the hazardous thing, to manage the hazard and make it, safer for people to be around and everything, and to work under those conditions. Like, it bothers me to a huge extent. I mean, if we were accustomed to not doing things because they happen to be hazardous, I wouldn't even be on here able to upload this video to this particular platform, because electricity never would have gotten its feet off the ground. Like, just because something happens to be hazardous doesn't mean there's nothing that can be done to reduce the potential harm that it does to humans. And that is a step that we take in almost every industry. And yet, for some reason, sex work is seen as if it's a special exemption for that. Like, it applies to all other industries, but it doesn't apply to sex work. And unfortunately, the countries under the Nordic model, whether the advocates of the Nordic model and the people that have been pushing it realize it or not, or who have been basically speaking in its favor realize it or not, and I do believe a lot of them are naive. They don't look into things as closely as I do, and everything. They're not as interested in things to look at it at a level of depth that I look at it at. They might not realize, for instance, that under the Nordic model, if a woman if a woman is basically in a home, and the proceeds from selling, are how she pays for her rent, and the cops find out, the people, her landlord may be considered a pimp under this law and these laws, and she may end up homeless in this whole thing, and they might not realize that if women team up to sell, they're also as well under this current system. If they, and if it's not even if it's just two women, if it's a woman and a man that's there to fight off men that might come in to hurt her, or commit violence against her, that that is now considered legally a brothel if they get busted, and so this I don't know. I don't think a lot of the people that were pushing, the Nordic model realize this, but this is what you're complicit in, and the consequences of your actions and your ignorance on this one have been pretty extreme. And so my own, from my vantage point, like, I'm not interested necessarily in buying, but I don't think a woman should be exposed to the most dangerous conditions possible just because she's a prostitute. I think that there are steps that can be taken to manage and reduce the risk to her as a person, and these questions are not being asked. Like, it's as if this segment of sex work is being considered off limits to that sort of thinking and to that sort of work. We're not thinking about how we could make it possible to do the work that they do in a way that doesn't, isn't as harmful to them, because we're so focused on stamping it out that because the harms of it are so documented and obvious and well known, including to the research community, that, a lot of people they look at that data and they're like, well, oh God, it has to be stamped out entirely because of the fact that there's all these harms and everything. But they're not asking, the right questions, which are like, there are all these harms that are associated with it. What can be done to reduce these harms, to manage them, to have a sort of harm reduction approach to it? Like, how do we, short of eliminating it, how do we make the working conditions of the women who work in this field more safe, especially given the tenacity that prostitution as a profession has shown into the world, in that the kitchen sink has been thrown at trying to eliminate it, and yet we have failed ultimately, despite massive efforts and tons of spending for over 100 years to wipe the world's oldest profession out. It has a staying power that could only be envied by other things and other concepts, and it's what I'm trying to say. Like, they've done a lot to try to eliminate it, and it's still here. It's still prevalent. It still hasn't been wiped out. It still exists, and to me, like I said, I mean, we are not accustomed in Western civilization to giving up on things because they happen to be hazardous. Steps can be taken, even in the context of sex work, that could make it less risky and dangerous. But under the Nordic model, many of the things and steps that could be taken to make sex work less dangerous are illegal. If she's living with a man that's there to serve as bodyguard, now he's pimping. Under these laws, the laws have been written in such a way as to be so vague, because, and I say this and everything, to me, it's like, don't look at what people say, look at the what they do, and the intentions behind these laws become very clear, because these are steps that could be taken to make sex work less dangerous, and so they make it into pimping and brothel keeping. Because the effort here is to stamp the world's oldest profession out by, regardless of the human cost. They don't care. They want to stamp it out even if a bunch of people get killed along the way, to doing it. And this reeks of the Soviet system. It decided that they had to modernize. The Soviet government decided that it had to modernize the USSR regardless of the human cost. A lot of people have been harmed in this process, and my heart goes out to them and everything, and it breaks for them and everything. Feminists are right. Sex work is dangerous, but that like I'm trying to indicate, danger can be mitigated even within the context of sex work, and yet it is not done. These are questions that aren't being asked, unfortunately. And like I said, I mean, no woman or man or father wants their daughter to be out there on the streets selling this sort of thing. But, you know, imagine she already is. Why aren't her working conditions safer?